welcome back. I hope you all have had a chance to visit with our vendors, drop off your passport in the basket, and hopefully meet some new friends. So our next guest literally just flew in from Maine, as in the state of Maine. So it is such a huge honor to have our next guest. Dave Iverson is an author, documentary film producer, and director, and a retired broadcast journalist. His new memoir, Winter Stars, An Elderly Mother, An Aging Son, and Life's Final Journey, tell the story of the 10-year caregiving odyssey that he shared with his mom until her passing at the age of 105. Dave has produced and reported more than 20 documentary specials for PBS, including the frontline film, My Father, My Brother, and Me, which explored his family's battle with Parkinson's disease, and Capturing Grace, which tells the story of what happened when a group of people with Parkinson's disease joined forces with a legendary New York City dance company. He was a radio and television reporter, producer, and host for nearly 40 years, first at Wisconsin Public Broadcasting, and then at San Francisco's NPR affiliate, KQED. His awards include a national Emmy, 4 regional Emmys, and numerous film festival citations. He is also a founding member of the Michael J. Fox Foundation's Patient Council. Winter Stars is Dave's first book. Please help me welcome Dave Iverson.
Well, thank you so much, Leisha and Keisha, and to everyone here for being here today. It's a real delight to be in Dallas. I haven't been here for a number of years, and it's really a pleasure to be here and to be able to speak with you today. Thank you so much for coming. As Leisha mentioned, I have a long family connection to Parkinson's, but I'm really going to focus today on a different topic, on the topic of caregiving, which of course also plays such a central role in so many families living with Parkinson's. Early one morning in the fall of 2013, I found my 101-year-old mom, Adelaide Iverson, sitting alone in her Menlo Park, California kitchen. She was wearing her favorite deep maroon bathrobe, and her walker was perched right beside her, angled out into the room. It was a familiar sight, familiar because I'd moved in with my mom 6 years before when she was a mere 95. She was still sharp, still active and engaged at that point, but no longer able to live alone. But as she approached the century mark, confusion and memory lapses had become more and more common. I'd noticed, but what I hadn't known until that fall morning was that my mom had noticed too. She turned to me as I entered the kitchen and said without preamble, "David, I think there are 2 Adelaides. There's the good Adelaide, the one who's pretty and smart and knows how to do things. And there's the bad Adelaide, the one who's ugly and stupid and can't do anything. I'm not sure which Adelaide is here right now," she said to me, "but I think it's the bad Adelaide." My mom had always been a force. She'd graduated from high school at age 16, from college at 20, and at the top of her class in both. She'd been a teacher, a devoted spouse, a mother of 3, a passionate sports fan, and a powerhouse volunteer. But now the long arc of her remarkable life was turning in a new direction. Yet she'd been able to describe what was happening to her with searing precision and without tears. She was like that. She didn't blink, confronting most challenges with a firm, no-nonsense demeanor. No one ever trifled with Adelaide Iverson, and that included me. When I decided to move in with my mom, I was a 59-year-old documentary filmmaker and NPR journalist living and working in San Francisco. My life was full, but it was also flexible. And my partner, Lynn, the woman who would later become my wife, understood the choice that I wanted to make. My mom and I had always been close, and we shared an easy bond. And when she needed help, I just figured I was the guy who could provide it. And honestly, without a great deal more thought than that, I moved back into my childhood home. But of course, there was so much I did not know. I didn't know I'd get so exhausted. I didn't know I'd be capable of getting so frustrated or so angry. I didn't know I'd be joined by remarkable women caregivers who became my teachers, my comrades, and my kin. And I didn't know that the Parkinson's disease that I'd been diagnosed with just a few years before would actually prove to be less challenging than being a caregiver. And I sure didn't know when I made the choice to move in that my mom would live for another decade before passing away at the age of 105. The choice I made to care for my mom is going to become increasingly common in our ever-aging society. Did you know that someone turns 65 in the United States every 8 seconds? So think about that for a moment. That means by this time tomorrow, 11 o'clock in the morning, Sunday, Dallas, there will be nearly 11,000 more 65-year-olds living in the United States than there are right now. That's our demographic reality. But it is also our caregiving reality and our caregiving future. And caregiving, as many of you know, affects nearly every family. Or to put it somewhat differently, nearly everyone in this room is either going to receive care or provide care, and very possibly experience both. But this is the funny thing, I think. Demographics make clear that we face an elder care crisis in this country, but it remains a surprisingly quiet crisis. Even when 200,000 people died in skilled nursing facilities and assisted living communities in the early months of the pandemic, it wasn't enough to encourage Congress to pass legislation that would have provided billions of dollars to improve elder care in this country, particularly for low-income Americans. It's a quiet crisis, even though according to AARP, there are 54 million family caregivers in the United States, mostly caring for someone old. And yet, our elder care crisis doesn't prompt much attention, much action. It mostly prompts avoidance. And I think there's a terrible irony to this. Because when you think about it, caregiving is a universal life experience, right? And yet we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it at the dinner table. We don't talk about it much in the halls of Congress either. And it's my belief that we need to make this quiet crisis the subject of a national conversation. And I believe the best chance we have to do that, to jumpstart that conversation, is by being personal, by talking about the reality of care, the love it requires, and the loss it often inflicts. We need to see and hear each other. We need to see that, in a sense, aging really represents our great American common bond. To slightly alter that famous sentence from former President Obama, when it comes to aging, there are no red states or blue states. There's only the United States. We're going to grow old together. So really what I want to do today is just tell you a story, a caregiving story, a personal story. And it's one that I need to begin with a personal acknowledgement. And that's this: I was really lucky as a caregiver. In fact, I had it about as good as any caregiver can have it. Yes, I'd recently been diagnosed with Parkinson's, but my Parkinson's remained stable during the time I was a caregiver, and fortunately remains largely stable to this day. But that's not why I was really so lucky. The main reason I was lucky was because of three little words. I had help. I had wonderful people coming in during the day so that I could go to work. I could walk out the front door of my mom's house in the morning and not come back until nightfall, when it was my turn to take over caring for my mom, evenings through the night and on the weekend. And as many of you know, most family caregivers don't get to walk out the front door in the morning and not come back until nighttime. And the fact that I could has everything to do with money and privilege, a topic I'll return to a bit later. But I wanted to start by making those 2 points. Number one, I was really lucky to have wonderful help. And number two, quality caregiving shouldn't depend on good luck. I was lucky in other ways as well, including the fact that my mom and I actually got along, which is not something you should necessarily assume in all family caregiving situations. My mom and I shared many of the same interests. We shared a similar political outlook. But perhaps most importantly, we shared the same team. We were both diehard Stanford University sports fans. You know Stanford. That's that other school out west that will soon be facing SMU in the ACC, that school. My mom and my dad started going to Stanford games in the early 1950s when my dad began his teaching career at the university. I started going to games at the age of 5, and I still go often today, but that's nothing compared to my mom. After my dad passed away, after his long journey with Parkinson's, my mom just kept going to games, sometimes by herself, sometimes with me, sometimes with friends. She threw out the first pitch at a Stanford baseball game at the age of 93. And after I moved in, we kept going to games, football, baseball, basketball, until she was well past 100. I once figured out that she had attended over 1,700 football, baseball, and basketball games at Stanford. And I learned that there's nothing quite like going to a college football game accompanied by a centenarian who keeps yelling, "Just tackle him, just get that guy." And yet, despite all my advantages, I wasn't ready for what lay ahead. As many of you know, caregiving can be exhausting, maddening, and completely relentless. But I also didn't expect to learn that caregiving offers moments when you feel like you understand life's purpose in a way you'd never understood it before. And I think that's because caregiving places you right at the center of life's crosscurrents. You experience love and anger, loss and joy, usually while exhausted and often on the same day. Caregiving is also so intensely physical, and that means that caregiving is also intimate. You learn how to transfer someone from bed to commode and back again. You learn how to spoon feed someone a meal when they can no longer do that themselves. You learn how to cleanse someone's fragile skin with gentleness. Caregiving is also biological. It resets your own biological clock as well, because that clock is now governed by someone else's biology. And I think as adults, we're almost all completely unprepared for that reality. I know I sure was. Sure, if you're a parent, you might have experienced something similar with a newborn. And yes, there can be striking similarities between what you do for the very young and what you do for the very old. But those similarities also illustrate the differences. Changing your baby's diaper? No big deal. Changing your mom's diaper? Not exactly the same experience. Before I moved in with my mom, what little I knew about caregiving really was because of her, by how she responded to my dad's long journey with Parkinson's disease. And it wasn't so much how she cared for my dad, it's how she lived with my dad. Her approach to Parkinson's was emblematic of her approach to life. No nonsense and action-oriented. You get up in the morning and you do what needs to be done for the good of your family and the good of your community. And after my dad's diagnosis, they just kept doing things. After all, there were all those political campaigns to follow, all those university lectures to attend, and of course, all those Stanford teams to keep cheering for. But as we all know, being action-oriented gets tougher over time. My dad's last years were difficult, both physically and cognitively. And when my mom could no longer care for him at home, she had to move him to a skilled nursing facility. But she was there every day. She'd arrive at 9 o'clock each morning, dressed to the nines, on her daily mission to make sure that my dad got the best of care. "You do not comb his hair like that," she would command. "You comb it like this. You do not call him Bill or Sweetie. You call him Dr. Iverson." I used to think that as soon as my mom was spotted arriving at the nursing home parking lot, that they probably got on the intercom to send out an all points alert. "Look out, Adelaide Iverson has arrived." My mom may have been all business, but her business was us, her husband, her family, her community. And so when the time came that she needed help, I thought about all that she had done for all of us, but especially for my dad, especially during those last difficult years with Parkinson's. And while it might sound kind of odd, I think the fact that I had recently been diagnosed with Parkinson's as well made me want to help that much more. It just felt like part of our family story. Now, my mom's fierce devotion to my dad never wavered, but I cannot say the same about my own steadfastness as a caregiver. I wavered plenty. As my mom began to decline, both physically and cognitively, caregiving got tougher. Nights, in particular, often seemed endless. It wasn't safe for her to go to the bathroom alone. And so we installed a bell right by her bedside that she could ring when she needed to get up. And if she needed to get up, that meant I needed to get up. And so when the bell rang, I'd stumble out of my bedroom 10 feet down the hall, the same bedroom, by the way, that I'd slept in as a little boy, the same single bed that I'd slept in as a little boy. And then I'd go and help her get into the bathroom and help with what followed. I got pretty good at donning gloves and then doing the rest. You wipe, you flush, and you're finished. Except you're not. because I'd have to help her back into bed, then stumble back into my own, knowing that that bell would quite likely ring again. Sometimes I thought it was a bit like having an alarm clock, only one that will just go off at random intervals. And 3-bell nights, as I came to call them, took their toll. And of course, when you're tired, your shortcomings become that much more exposed, right? Your patience diminishes, your shortcomings advance. So I'd like to tell you some of mine. For starters, I'm someone who likes to be in charge. And as you learn as a care provider, you are so not really in charge. I'm also someone who likes to be right. And not only that, I like explaining to you why I'm right. It took me a long time to realize that being right, especially when caring for someone with progressing dementia, is an almost entirely useless attribute. It took me too long to realize that the phrase, "Mom, don't you remember?" is one of the least useful phrases in the English language. Being a good caregiver for someone with dementia is about comprehension, not correction. It's about trying to understand the truth beneath their words, not correcting the words themselves. Here's an example. One day, when my mom was past 100, I walked into her bedroom and I was greeted with her intense glare. This wasn't entirely novel, but what she said next was something I never expected to hear. "David," she said to me, "I know that you were married to someone else before you were married to me." I've since learned that it's not uncommon for sons to become husbands or wives to become daughters. But in that moment, it was stunning. And all I could think to say was, "Mom, I'm not your husband, I'm your son," which wasn't that helpful. It didn't register. One day, she even asked me if I'd like to climb into the hospital bed and lie down beside her. But in time, I came to realize that those statements actually made complete sense. My mom had always preferred the company of men, something that I'd loved teasing her about. And that Adelaide hadn't really gone away. She'd just become a starker, more concentrated version of herself. My dad, whom she adored, had been gone for more than 20 years, but she still wanted a man. She still wanted a husband. And she'd take me. After all, in her view, I was available. Her body and mind may have begun to shrink, but her essential core was still there. She was still Adelaide Iverson. But I was slow to appreciate the reality of that experience, slow to understand the truth behind those words. More often than not, I just react out of confusion or sometimes irritation or sometimes anger. I remember once taking my mom to my Aunt Alice's house for dinner. She was hosting a family gathering, a role that my mom had always cherished playing but could no longer perform. And when we arrived at my aunt's house, my mom was crabby, and I wasn't exactly at my best either. And finally, I walked over to her and said, exactly as I would have to a 4-year-old, "If you can't act better, we're going home." A few minutes later, we headed for the dinner table. I didn't know that you could stalk across the floor while using a walker, but my mom did. My aunt asked her where she'd like to sit. My mom snapped at her again. "That's it," I said, "we're going home." I steered her out of the dining room, out the front door, into the driveway, into the car, and we drove home in silence. when we arrived back at the house, I ushered her into her room, and she stood there by the side of her bed, gripping her walker tightly. And then she just collapsed onto the bed and wailed, "I hate myself." And here's the thing. I didn't say a word. I didn't feel anything other than a cold sense of satisfaction. But in time, as I'd look back at that moment, I came to realize that I hadn't really taken in what my mom was saying. I hadn't taken in her truth. I think when she said she hated herself, she meant exactly that. She hated who she was becoming, hated the sense that she was increasingly trapped in a world where she could no longer be who she had always been, including the person who had always hosted family occasions. My mom's wail was from the heart, but sometimes I felt like my own had turned cold. I remember another time when I blew up at my mom for reasons I cannot even remember. And she started crying. And do you know what I said? I said, "Go ahead and cry." And then I stomped out of the room, slammed the door like a teenager, and stood in the garage. And I remember it was raining, and I could hear the raindrops falling on the roof. I remember just standing there and thinking, what is happening? What's happening to me? Who am I becoming? And then after a while, I walked back into the kitchen and I sat down beside my mom, and I was the one who burst into tears. And do you know what my mom did? She reached out to me and said in a soft voice, "Don't cry, David. Don't cry." So this is caregiving, right? You get all of it. You get the Stanford games, but you also get the tears. Tears of anger, and if you're lucky, as I was, tears of forgiveness as well. You get all of it, and sometimes you get all of it on the same day. I think being a really good caregiver means you have to summon strength when you no longer have anything to summon. You have to realize that, sure, you're exhausted, but the person you're caring for is probably exhausted too, and not just from lack of sleep. They're also exhausted from what must be the incredible strain of looking out into a world you no longer fully understand. Being a good caregiver means you have to be loving. I mean really loving, like 90% of the time. And that's a really hard standard to meet, and one I often didn't. So how do we do better? How do we do better at making it easier to be more loving in our society? I know that might be a little bit of an unusual way to put it, but that's really our challenge, isn't it? How do we become a more loving society? How do we provide that support for those in need of care? Well, for starters, I think we have to listen to care providers. We have to gather their stories and make them known, because I believe it's those stories that can help turn this quiet crisis into one that demands recognition. And here's one simple thing we can all do to start that process. We can talk to caregivers. We can listen to what they need. And that means avoiding the phrase that all of us have said hundreds and hundreds of times, "Let me know if you need something." Instead, it means talking to them, hearing what they need, or just calling up and saying, "I'm going to the grocery store. Would you like 1 carton of milk or 2? Or I'd like to come over on Saturday. I'm going to rake the leaves and mow the lawn. Or maybe best of all, I'm going to come over on Saturday and sit with John so that you can go out for a long walk. When former Facebook executive Sheryl Sandberg lost her husband at a very early age, and when she was deep in grief, she said the best call she ever got was someone who just called her up and said, Sheryl, I'm bringing you a cheeseburger. You just got to tell me whether you want mayo or mustard. Sometimes caregivers just need a carton of milk. Sometimes it's just a cheeseburger. Small stuff, sure. But here's something I really believe. Most caregivers need more help than they think they do. And most caregivers realize that later than they should. So listen to them, talk to them, hear them, and respond to what they say. And I think by listening to caregivers and beginning to tell these stories, that helps us make the case for real change, why we need to do more in this country to support elder care, why we need to consider things that will improve the life of care providers, whether that's tax credits or Social Security credits for the time they take off of work, and many other things. And most important, we have to make sure not to forget and tell the stories of low-income care providers and low-income care recipients who do not get the support they need. And we need to tell the stories of professional caregivers too. I may have had my struggles as a care provider, but I had extraordinary help from the women who stayed with me and helped me. And so I'd like to tell you their names. Mele Taufa, Eileen Khan, Ronette Morales, Sinai Latu. Those were the 4 women who were with me most of that decade. When I fell flat on my face, they lifted me up. When I stumbled, they just admired that I was trying. They taught me that caregiving is at its essence a physical act of love, which must be renewed each and every day. And those remarkable women, all immigrant Americans, all women of color, all women for whom English was a second or third language, gave me an extraordinary gift. They were just there when I needed them. You know, there's probably no issue more contentious in our country right now than immigration. And I know those issues here in Texas and in the Southwest are particularly intense. And it's a problem that demands attention and solution. But I have a request. As we think about that, let us also remember the caregivers, the immigrants, because it is a profession largely dominated by immigrants, and how we need those skills. Skills like endurance and hard work and compassion and kindness and the skillful touch. Because right now in this country, we don't value those attributes enough. According to the Economic Policy Institute, 1 in 7 professional caregivers live below the poverty line. We have to begin to address that. Again, I was lucky. I was able to pay Ronette and Mele and Sinai and Eileen a better wage than that. But do you know why? It's because my parents bought a home in Menlo Park, California, in what would become the heart of Silicon Valley in 1950 for $15,000. And by the time I moved in 2007, it was worth just a little bit more than that. And that meant I could borrow against the value of that house again and again and again to pay for excellent care. But that's not exactly a national elder care policy, is it? Make sure your parents bought a home in Menlo Park, California in 1950 and you'll be fine. We have to do better. than that. We have to do our part to change this quiet crisis and bring action. We need to make sure that all our citizens, go through life's final journey accompanied by skilled and dedicated family care providers, by family, and by a larger community like this one of caring. A friend of mine who's a caregiver for his spouse put it to me like this: "We're all carried in life," he said. "Sometimes we're carried by others, sometimes we do the carrying. And I think it's when we carry each other that we become a true community. And honestly, I can't think of anything our country needs more than that. I think it's central to how we become more loving." I'm going to close by reading a short excerpt from my book, Winter Stars: An Elderly Mother, an Aging Son, and Life's Final Journey. And it's about this topic, about being carried and carrying. The passage I'm going to read took place during the last Christmas that I spent with my mom. At this point, she was past 104 years of age. And during that last year, she was often confused and agitated and really restless. And I used to worry that she was never going to be at peace. But on this particular night, something different happened. From Winter Stars. When I walked into my mom's bedroom, I knew right away that on this December night, she was in a different place. There wasn't any restlessness. She just seemed quiet and calm. She looked to be, quite remarkably, at peace. We just sat there for a long time, holding hands, and I felt a wave of tenderness come over me. After a while, my mom looked up at me, and she said in a voice that was soft, but only slightly slurred, "You look wonderful." And I told her that she looked wonderful too. And I said, "We make a good pair." And she said, "What a pair." We sat, my hand on top of hers, just sitting, nothing more. And then she turned her head from the hospital bed and looked at me and said, "I feel lucky." And she said it with more clarity than anything I'd heard her say in many months. And I told her that I felt lucky too, lucky for all that she had added to my life and to the lives of those around her. And I would always try to remember what she had given me and what she taught me. And then she said it again. "I feel lucky." And so I asked her if she could tell me why. And there was a long pause, and then she looked at me with eyes as bright as winter stars and said, "Because there's love all around." On that Christmas night, I felt something I hadn't experienced before. That while my time with my mom was still unfinished, our journey together was now complete. We'd endured our bursts of anger and frustration, but over time, our deep and abiding connection had always held. We had found a steadying, and while the currents of time and age had taken us into territory we had never imagined, we'd kept traveling. And that journey had carried us to our truest destination as mother and son. It had brought me to the bedside of someone I loved so that I could hear the deepest of all truths, that there is love all around. Thank you for having me here today. Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you. I think we have maybe a little bit of time, Leisha. So if anyone has a question they'd like to pose, other than about Stanford football, I'd be happy to do my best to respond.
Do you plan to do any documentaries concerning aging and relationships with family relationships within aging?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking it, because I did spend a lot of my life in documentary film work, some of which are touched on in other films I've done. And I'm actually working on a documentary right now that's about a friend of mine who has a condition probably many of you know of called multiple system atrophy, which is like a much more aggressive form of Parkinson's. And it does get into some of those questions of care and support. Making films is really hard and very time consuming. And I'm doing this as a volunteer. And honestly, at the age of 75, I'm not sure how many more films I really want to make. But it's a wonderful question, and I really appreciate your asking it. And it is the kind of story we need, I think, to draw attention to the great needs we have to address elder care and caregiving in this country. So probably won't be fully for me, but I'll sure support whoever wants to make that film.
It seems like most of the documentaries, the films, and have always sort of made caregiving, they've made it very light and taken a very, what's the word I'm trying to find? A simplistic path to it. And it's so complex. And I know I have a brother that is also Parkinson's patient, and he's living in a facility, and he doesn't have the financial resources.
Yeah.
And his life in there is very, very different and than the experiences that I'm having. And I've come to realize how difficult it must be for people without resources.
Yeah.
It's just, it's got to be inhumane almost.
Yeah.
And there needs to be somebody that pushes that into the attention of the people.
Yeah.
So that there's a response to it by our government.
Well, I think the somebody is all of us. I think the somebody is that we need to advocate for. When Mason was here earlier talking about the policy work of the Michael J. Fox Foundation, which is a fantastic organization and one I've had a long, long relationship with. These kinds of policy items have to be part of that agenda as well, and we do need to draw attention to this. And it is a story that really, really does need telling. I do think there are skilled nursing homes and assisted living facilities that do the best they can, for sure. But the resources that it requires to do that and the costs that it requires are extraordinary. Toward the ends of my mom's life, we were spending $15,000 a month on caregiving, and that's 5 years ago, you know? So, and yes, it's a pricey area, but we've been slow to recognize this, and it's one that I just urge all of you to advocate on behalf of this. I know we can only advocate for so much, but it's a concern and a cause that needs that too. Well, okay.
In the interest of asking how the caregiver is doing, I'd like to hear whatever you have to say about what you're doing to take care of yourself with your Parkinson's.
Yeah. Again, I was really lucky because I had people there during the day, and I had friends of my mom who would come by and visit. She referred to them as her young friends, meaning they were in their mid 80s. And that was helpful. It allowed me to get out. I took up long distance running when I was a caregiver, in part just to be by myself for a while, and because I knew that kind of intense exercise was going to be really helpful for my own well-being, especially with Parkinson's. That's why I think when we can just say, you know, I know especially if you can say, hey, I know what this is like. To go there and do that and provide that time and space for people is really, really important. But you know, I must have heard 100 times, and many of you who are care providers have heard this too, and it's a well-meaning and it's a true sentence, but you get a little tired of hearing it, which is, well, you know, you can't care for someone else unless you take care of yourself. Well, fine, but easier said than done. Because you can have made it an arrangement for someone to come and stay with the person you're caring for, but if that person isn't doing that well that day, what are you going to do? Are you going to say, sorry, I'm going to go to the movies? No, you're going to stay there and care for that person. Caregivers take care of people all the time without taking care of themselves. It's a big thing, and I just want people to realize that it's not easy to take care of yourself when you're a caregiver. You have to be lucky, you have to have resources, again, that word, and we all have to do our part and just show up for others in need. Well, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to confess two things. One, my book is available. The proceeds, the author royalties from it, go to support nonprofits, including the Michael J. Fox Foundation, and today, including the Dallas Area Parkinson's Society. So if you'd like to come by, that'd be great. I blew it and forgot my little square to take credit card payments, but cash is good, Venmo works, and if you have neither, you can just take a book, I'll sign it, and then you can make a donation to the DAPS, okay? So do come by if you can.
Thank you so Dave, we are so thankful for all that you've given. You've sacrificed a lot to make it here today and to share your story that I think resonates with so many of us on so many levels. So thank you so very much. We would like to present you with a book, and this is actually written by one of our DAPS members, John from Duncanville. I'm looking for your hat. He took his hat off. So we hope that you will enjoy his words of wisdom and inspiration, as I know we have. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Okay, so after that wonderful presentation, I hope that you guys are now ready to move forward so that we can get ready for lunch. We're going to take a 15-minute break to set up our room for lunch, which is going to be held right here in Asbury. So during this break, you can visit with Dave at his table that's up there on the top level, and any other vendors that you haven't had a chance to meet. As we said, make sure that you sign your passport because we have a nice raffle at the end of the day that we'd like to announce our winner. And that basket is right there before you leave this particular room. And I think that's it. Is that all? Oh, yes. And so we'll remind you again, but for the palliative care program, that is actually going to be held in the sanctuary versus beginnings room, but I will remind you of that again after lunch so that you know where you're going after our lunch. So please enjoy.